welcome to another broadcast of Comics Let's Talk. I'm your host, Kevin Gibbon. I review comic books and have columns on two sites, the Comics for Sinners website and the Comics Crusaders website. Check them out. Check out my reviews and check out my columns. If you like what you read, let me know in the comments section below. If you don't like it, let me know too. Let me know what you liked, what you didn't like. My comic book reviews for Comic Crusaders and Comics for Sinners. And my co-host April Childers could not be here today. It's a special show to commemorate the life of one of the greatest comic book creators of all time, the late Steve Ditko. I want to remind everybody, if you love comic books, make sure you subscribe to my channel. Got a lot of interesting comic books coming up, including the launch of my own franchise by Evil Cat Comics in October, Karl Vincent Vampire Hunter. Steve Ditko was an American comics artist and writer, best known as the artist and co-creator with Stan Lee of the Marvel Comics superheroes Spiderman and Doctor Strange. Ditko studied under Batman artist Jerry Robinson at the Cartoonist and Illustrators School in New York City. He began his professional career in 1953, working in the studio of Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, beginning as an inker and coming under the influence of artist Mort Miskin. During this time, he then began his long association with Carlton Comics, where he did work in the genres of science fiction, horror, and mystery. He also co-created the superhero Captain Atom in 1960. During the 1950s, Ditko also drew for Atlas Comics, a forerunner of Marvel Comics. He went on to contribute much significant work to Marvel. In 1966, after being the exclusive artist on The Amazing Spider-Man and the Doctor Strange feature in Strange Tales, Ditko left Marvel for reasons he never specified. Ditko continued to work for Charlton and also DC Comics, including a revamp of the long-running character the Blue Beetle, and creating or co-creating The Question, The Creeper, Shade the Changing Man, and Hawk and Dove. Ditko also began contributing to small independent publishers, where he created Mr. A.
Mr. A is based on Ayn Rand's theory of justice, on Aristotle's law of identity, his definition of man, and his view of art. Aristotle said that art is philosophically more important than history. History tells how men did act, art shows how men could and should act. Art creates a model, an ideal man as a measuring standard. Without a measuring standard, nothing can be identified or judged, but everything can be measured. Disease and sicknesses are measured by a healthy organ or body. All measurement requires an appropriate standard. With it, one can measure down to atoms, up to the stars, and the changes in the character of a man. Aristotle defined man as a rational animal. Rationality is a potential that has to be actualized by choice and the right thinking method of logic applied to reason. The standard of measurement for all is the rational logical ruler. It objectively measures the rational and irrational thinking. A hero measures a man at his best in the worst situations. A hero is a man admired for his qualities or achievements and regarded as an ideal or model. Aristotle formulated the law of identity. A is A. A thing is what it is. It has a specific nature and identity. The truth cannot contradict itself and also be a lie. A refusal to sacrifice the good to the evil or to accept any part of the evil as a greater good. Society revealing the character's choices and actions that identify them and lead to a just ending where the hero and the right view of life wins. Early comic book heroes were not about life as it is, but creations of how a man with a clear understanding of right and wrong and more courage chose to act, even if branded an outlaw. He dispensed a better justice than a pervading legal moral one. He was a moral avenger. He was not like everyone else, not the average, the common, or the ordinary man. He was the exceptional one, the uncommon one, the one doing what others were unwilling to do, regardless of the opposition and consequences to himself. His success provided a better model. Through a hero, one could identify the foolish, the corrupt, and the guilty. A lead character can be better or worse than society's best model, and if a man with proven better qualities appears, then a new measuring standard for men and society is established. A hero is a model for everyone, but not everyone is willing to act at his best. A less demanding model, blending good and bad, is more comforting, easier to accept. For the self-flawed, an anti-hero provides a heroic label without the need to act better. A crooked cop, a flawed cop, is not a valid model of a good law enforcer. An anti-cop corrupts the legal good, an anti-hero corrupts the moral good. Both corrupt ideals. Both choose the flaw over the perfect. The perfect is identified and measured by what is possible to man, a perfect bowling score. A perfect response accepts the truth and rejects the lie. The perfect hero on principle says yes to a true identity and no to a contradictory one. Ruled by justice, he treats every identity as it deserves. He is the actualized potential for good in its purest form, a true moral measuring ruler. He is the most human and deserving of respect. Today's flawed superheroes are superior in physical strength, but common, average, ordinary in mental strength. Rich in superpowers, but bankrupt in reasoning powers. They are perfect in overcoming the flawed supervillains, saving the world, the universe, yet helpless to solve their common, ordinary, average personal problems. It is like creating a perfectly physical adult with the reasoning limits of a 6-year-old. The creators of flawed ideals believe that no real difference exists between a flawed hero and a flawed villain. Both have some good and some bad in them, so they blend into a grayness where no one is better than anyone else, and where the worst can justifiably claim that he is as good as gray as the best. If it is impossible to know what is true and to do what is right, then the flaw, the worst, will be the new standard of good. Man will be defined as a flawed, anti-rational animal, and all that corrupts and harms life will be the new virtues. Like deliberately flawed eyesight, where self-blindness is the ideal, anti-life behavior will be the new standard for living. Moral standard.
Ditko largely declined to give interviews, saying he preferred to communicate through his work. Stephen J. Ditko was born on November 2, 1927, in Johnston, Pennsylvania, the son of first-generation Americans of Slovak descent. Stephen Ditko, an artistically talented master carpenter at a steel mill, and Anna, a homemaker. The second eldest child in a working-class family, he was preceded by Sister Anna Marie and followed by Sister Elizabeth and Brother Patrick. Inspired by his father's love of newspaper comic strips, particularly Hal Foster's Prince Valiant, Ditko found his interest in comics accelerated by the introduction of superhero Batman in 1940, and by Will Eisner's The Spirit, which appeared in a tabloid-sized comic book insert in Sunday newspapers. Upon graduating from Johnston High School in 1945, he enlisted in the U.S. Army on October 26, 1945, and did military service in post-war Germany, where he drew comics for an Army newspaper. Ditko learned that his idol, Batman artist Jerry Robinson, was teaching at the Cartoonists and Illustrators School, which was later called the School of Visual Arts in New York City. Moving there in 1950, he enrolled in the art school under the GI Bill. Robinson found the young student a very hard worker who really focused on his drawing, and someone who could work well with other writers as well as write his own stories and create his own characters. And he helped Ditko acquire a scholarship for the following year. He was in my class for 2 years, 4 or 5 days a week, 5 hours a night. It was very intense. Robinson, who invited artists and editors to speak with his class, once brought Stan Lee, then editor of Marvel Comics' 1950s precursor Atlas Comics, and I think that was when Stan first saw Steve's work, said Robinson. Ditko began professionally illustrating comic books in early 1953, drawing writer Bruce Hamilton's science fiction story Stretching Things for the key publications imprint Stanmore Publications, which sold the story to Ajax Farrell, where it finally found publication in Fantastic Fears number 5, cover dated February 1954. Shortly afterward, Ditko found work at the studio of writer-artists Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who had created Captain America and other characters. Beginning as an inker on backgrounds, Ditko was soon working with and learning from Morton Meskin, an artist whose work he had long admired. Meskin was fabulous, Ditko once recalled. I couldn't believe the ease with which he drew. Strong competitions, loose pencils, yet complete detail without clutter. I loved his stuff. Ditko then began a long association with the Derby, Connecticut publisher Carlton Comics, a low-budget division of a company best known for song lyric magazines. Beginning with the cover of The Thing, number 12, in February of 1954, and with the 8-page vampire story Cinderella. In that issue, Ditko would continue to work intermittently for Charlton until the company's demise in 1986, producing science fiction, horror, and mystery stories, as well as co-creating Captain Atom with writer Joe Gill in Space Adventures number 33, March 1960. He first went on hiatus from the company and comics altogether in mid-1954 when he contracted tuberculosis and returned to his parents' home in Johnston to recuperate. After he recovered and moved back to New York City in late 1955, Ditko began drawing for Atlas Comics, the 1950s precursor of Marvel Comics, beginning with the 4-page There Will Be Some Changes Made in Journey into Mystery number 33. That was 1956. This debut tale would be reprinted in Marvel's Curse of the Weird number 4 back in 1994. Ditko would go on to contribute a large number of stories, many considered to be classic, to Atlas, Marvel's Strange Tales, and the newly launched Amazing Adventures, Strange Worlds, Tales of Suspense, and Tales to Astonish, issues of which would typically open with a Kirby-drawn monster story, followed by one or two twist-ending thrillers or sci-fi tales drawn by Don Heck, Paul Reinman, or Joe Sinnott, all capped by an often surreal, sometimes self-reflexive short by Ditko and writer Stan Lee. These Lee Ditko short stories proved so popular that Amazing Adventures was reformatted to feature such stories exclusively, beginning with issue number 7 in 1961. When the comic was rechristened Amazing Adult Fantasy, a name intended to reflect its more sophisticated nature, as likewise the new tagline, "The magazine that respects your intelligence." Lee in 2009 described these short 5-page filler strips that Steve and I did together, originally placed in any of our comics that had a few extra pages to fill, as odd fantasy tales that I'd dream up with O. Henry-type endings. Giving an early example of what would later be known as the Marvel method of writer-artist collaboration, Lee said, "All I had to do was give Steve a one-line description of the plot, and he'd be off and running. He'd take those skeleton outlines I had given him and turn them into classic little works of art that ended up being far cooler than I had any right to expect." After Marvel Comics editor-in-chief Stan Lee obtained permission from publisher Martin Goodman to create a new ordinary teen superhero named Spiderman, Lee originally approached his leading artist, Jack Kirby. Kirby told Lee about his own 1950s character conception, variously called the Silver Spider and Spider-Man, in which an orphaned boy finds a magic ring that gives him superpowers. Comics historian Greg Theakston says Lee and Kirby immediately sat down for a story conference, and Lee afterward directed Kirby to flesh out the character and draw some pages. A day or two later, Kirby showed Lee the first 6 pages, and, as Lee recalled, "I hated the way he was doing it. Not that he did it badly, it just wasn't the character I wanted. It was too heroic." Lee turned to Ditko, who developed a visual motif Lee found satisfactory. Although Lee would later replace Ditko's original cover with one penciled by Kirby, Ditko said, "The Spider-Man pages Stan showed me were nothing like the eventually published character." In fact, the only drawings of Spider-Man were on the splash page and at the end, where Kirby had the guy leaping at you with a web gun. Anyway, the first 5 pages took place in the home, and the kid finds a ring and turns into Spider-Man. Ditko also recalled that one of the first things I did was to work up a costume, a vital visual part of the character. I had to know how he looked before I did any breakdowns. For example, a clinging power so he wouldn't have hard shoes or boots, a hidden wrist shooter versus a web gun and holster, etc. I wasn't sure Stan would like the idea of covering the character's face, but I did it because it had an obviously boyish face. It would also add mystery to the character. From 1958 to either 1966 or 68, accounts differ, Ditko shared a Manhattan studio at 43rd Street and 8th Avenue with noted fetish artist Eric Stanton, an art school classmate. Whether either artist was under deadline pressure, it was not uncommon for them to pitch in and help the other with this assignment. After drawing the final issue of The Incredible Hulk, which was number 6 in March of '63, Ditko created the supernatural hero Dr. Strange in Strange Tales number 110. Ditko and Lee shortly thereafter relaunched a Hulk series as a short feature in the anthology Tales to Astonish, beginning with issue number 60. Ditko, inked by George Russos, penciled the feature through number 67. Ditko designed the Hulk's primary antagonist, the Leader, in issue number 62. That was in 1964. Ditko also penciled the Iron Man feature in Tales of Suspense number 47 through 49 with various inkers. The first of these debuted the initial version of Iron Man's modern red and golden armor, though whether Ditko or cover penciler and principal character designer Jack Kirby designed the costume is uncertain. Eventually, Lee and Ditko would take Strange into ever more abstract realms. In an epic 17-issue story arc in Strange Tales number 130 through 146, Lee and Ditko introduced the cosmic character Eternity, who personified the universe and was depicted as a silhouette whose outlines are filled with the cosmos. After 4 years on the title, Ditko left Marvel. He and Lee had not been on speaking terms for some time, with art and editorial changes handled through intermediaries. The details of the rift remain uncertain, even to Lee, who confessed in 2003, "I never really knew Steve on a personal level." Ditko later claimed it was Lee who broke off contact and disputed the long-held belief that the disagreement was over the true identity of the Green Goblin. Stan never knew what he was getting in my Spider-Man stories and covers until after production manager Saul Brodsky took the material from me. So there couldn't have been any disagreement or agreement, no exchanges, no problems between us concerning the Green Goblin or anything else from issue number 25 to my final issues. Spider-Man successor artist John Romita in a 2010 deposition recalled that Lee and Ditko ended up not being able to work together because they disagreed on almost everything. Cultural, social, historically, everything they disagreed on characters. A friendly farewell was given to Ditko in the bullpen bulletins of comics cover dated July 1966. Back at Carlton, where the page rate was low but creators were allowed greater freedom, Ditko worked on such characters as the Blue Beetle, The Question, and Captain Atom, returning to the character he co-created in 1960. In addition, in 1966 and 67, he drew 16 stories, most of them written by Archie Goodwin, for Warren Publishing's horror comics magazines, Creepy and Eerie, generally using an ink and wash technique. Objectivism is a philosophical system developed by Russian-American writer Ayn Rand. Rand first expressed objectivism in her fiction, most notably The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and later in non-fiction essays and books. Leonard Peikoff, a professional philosopher and Rand's designated intellectual heir, gave it a more formal structure. Peikoff characterizes objectivism as a closed system that is not subject to change. In 1967, Ditko gave his objectivist ideas ultimate expression in the form of Mr. A, published in Wally Wood's independent title Wits End number 3. Ditko's hard line against criminals was controversial, and he continued to produce Mr. A stories and one-pagers until the end of the 1970s. Ditko returned to Mr. A in 2000 and in 2009. Ditko moved to DC Comics in 1968, where he co-created The Creeper in Showcase number 73, 1968, with Don Siegel, under editor Murray Boltinoff. DC Comics writer and executive Paul Levitz observed that Ditko's art on the Creeper stories made them look unlike anything else being published by DC at that time. Ditko co-created the team Hawk and Dove in Showcase number 75 with writers Steve Skeets. Around this time, he penciled the lead story written and inked by Wally Wood in Wood's early mature audience independent comic publication, Heroes Inc. presents Canon. Objectivism's central tenets are that reality exists independently of unconsciousness, that human beings have direct contact with reality through sense perception, that one can attain objective knowledge from perception through the process of concept formation, inductive logic, that the proper moral purpose of one's life is the pursuit of one's own happiness, that the only social system consistent with this morality is one that displays full respect for individual rights, embodied in laissez-faire capitalism, and that the role of art in human life is to transform humans' metaphysical ideas by selective reproduction of reality into a physical form, a work of art that one can comprehend and to which one can respond emotionally. Ditko's stay at DC was short. He would work on all 6 issues of the Creeper's own title, Beware the Creeper, though leaving midway through the final one, and the reasons of his departure, again, were uncertain. But while at DC, Ditko recommended Carlton staffer Dick Giordano to the company, who would go on to become a top DC penciler, inker, editor, and ultimately, in 1981, the managing editor. From this time up through the mid-1970s, Ditko worked exclusively with Charlton and various small press independent publishers. Frank McLaughlin, Charlton's art director during this period, describes Ditko as living in a local hotel in Derby for a while. He was a very happy-go-lucky guy with a great sense of humor at that time, and always supplied the color spectators with candy and other little gifts. For Charlton in 1974, he did Liberty Bell backup stories in E-Man and conceived Killjoy. Ditko produced much work for Charlton's science fiction and horror titles, as well as for former Marvel co-publisher Martin Goodwin's startup line, Atlas Seaboard Comics, where he co-created the superhero The Destructor with writer Archie Goodwin, and penciled all 4 issues of the namesake series, the first 2 of which were inked by Wally Wood. Ditko worked on the 2nd and 3rd issues of Tiger Man and the 3rd issue of Morlock 2001 with Bernie Wrightson inking. Ditko returned to DC Comics in 1975, creating a short-lived title, Shade the Changing Man. Ditko returned to Marvel in 1979, taking over Jack Kirby's Machine Man, drawing the Micronauts and Captain Universe, and continuing to freelance for the company into the late 1990s. Starting in 1984, he penciled the last 2 years of the Space Robot series, ROM. In 1982, he also began freelancing for the early independent comics label Pacific Comics, beginning with Captain Victory and the Galactic Rangers #6, in which he introduced his superhero, Missing Man, with Mark Evanier scripting to Ditko's plot and art. Subsequent Missing Man stories appeared in Pacific Presents #1 through 3, with Ditko scripting the former and collaborating with longtime friend Robin Snyder on the script for the latter 2. Ditko also created the Mocker for Pacific in Silver Star #2, April 1983. For Eclipse Comics, he contributed a story featuring his character Static, no relation to the later Milestone Comics character, in Eclipse Monthly #1 through 3, introducing supervillain The Exploder in #2 with writer Jack C. Harris. Ditko drew the backup feature, The Faceless Ones, in First Comics Warp #2 through 4. Working with that same writer and others, Ditko drew a handful of Fly, Flygirl, and Jaguar stories for the Fly #2 through 8. For Archie Comics' short-lived 1980s superhero line, in a rare latter-day instance of Ditko inking another artist, he inked penciler Dick Ayers on the Jaguar story in the Fly #9. In 1992, Ditko worked with writer Will Murray to produce one of his last original characters for Marvel Comics, the superheroine Squirrel Girl, who debuted in Marvel Superheroes Volume 2, #8. Steve Ditko was awarded the following: in 1962, the Alley Award for Best Short Story, Origin of Spiderman. In 1963, another Alley Award for Best Adventure Hero Comic Book, The Amazing Spider-Man. Also the Alley Award for Top Hero, Spider-Man. In 1964, the Alley Award was attributed to him for Best Adventure Hero Comic Book, The Amazing Spider-Man. In 1964, Alley Award for Best Giant Comic, The Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1. Also the Alley Award for Best Hero, you guessed it, Spider-Man. In 1965, he got the Alley Award for Best Adventure Hero Comic, The Amazing Spider-Man, and then the Alley Award the same year for Best Hero Spider-Man. Do you get the feeling that the Alley Award judges were big Spider-Man fans? Just saying. But anyway, 1985, he won the Eagle Award for Roll of Honor. In 1987, Ditko was presented a Comic-Con International Inkpot Award in absentia, accepted on his behalf by Renegade Press publisher Denny Lubert, who had published Ditko's Worlds the previous year. Ditko refused the award and returned it to Lubert after having phoned her to say, "Awards bleed the artists and make us compete against each other. They are the most horrible things in the world. How dare you accept this on my behalf?" At his behest, Lubert returned the award to the convention organizers. Ditko was inducted into the Jack Kirby Hall of Fame in 1990 and into the Will Eisner Hall of Fame in 1994. He also had the Inkwell Awards in 2015, Joe Sinnott Hall of Fame Award. That was our look at the late, great Steve Ditko, who passed away this past week. I'm glad you could join us for this show. I want to remind everybody, if you love comic books, make sure you subscribe to my channel. Got a lot of interesting comic books coming up, including the launch of my own franchise by Evil Cat Comics in October, Karl Vincent Vampire Hunter. The first novel was Last Rites, The Return of Sebastian Vasilis. It has been adapted into comic book format and can be found on Indie Planet along with all the other Karl Vincent Vampire Hunter comic books. It's also being made into a movie out of Lakeland, Florida through Crisp Filmworks. Check out the Facebook page, Karl Vincent Vampire Hunter. Also, Last Rites, The Return of Sebastian Vasilis. If you like what you see and want to stay up to date, just click like on both pages. There are many other comic books available on Indie Planet and Drive-Thru Comic Books of the Karl Vincent Vampire Hunter franchise. The latest comic book is Dracula Rising. We're on issue 2. Issue 1 was drawn by Dennis Magnett, who since had to move on to other projects. So my new artist is Rodolfo Ezequiel. Going to show you some panels from his artwork right now. Rodolfo is an excellent artist, and these are panels that he has drawn for the Dracula Rising #2 issue. There's also an animated trailer out. Let's take a look at a little bit of the animated trailer.
Who are you?
Your worst nightmare.
I think you dropped these.
Thanks.
You're not very good at this, are you?
I'm Karl Vincent.
Another vampire hunter wannabe. Do you know how many of you that I've killed? You can't leave yet. The party's just begun.
I hope to use this trailer to sell the project to maybe Adult Swim or Cartoon Network or something like that. And look up Karl Vincent Vampire Hunter on Facebook. If you like what you see, click like and stay tuned for more information on upcoming comic books and movies and animation featuring Karl Vincent Vampire Hunter. You can find all things Karl Vincent on Amazon, Indie Planet, Drive-Thru Comics, and Kindle. Until next week, this is Kevin Given saying so long and keep reading those comics.